And what are some projects that you've done that our viewers might be familiar with?
Commercials. Mountain Dew. I did a Mountain Dew commercial with Bo Diddley. And Johnny Copeland, I did a Coke commercial with. But they weren't all blues. I remember somebody called me and said, "Hey, look, we got James Cotton coming in. We're going to have him do a Skippy peanut butter commercial." I said, "Well, what does that have to do with me? James Cotton, And they're going, "Well, we would like your band to come in." They had heard the Hudson River Rats and play behind James. And so they went in and did the Skippy commercial. So I did a lot of commercials, and then I was starting to get commercials. In the mid-'80s, I started getting involved a little bit more with, not to say, mostly harmonica, but I was playing in a club around the mid-'80s, and here's where the connection came in with Blood, Sweat, and Tears. All my friends from the New York and Jersey area, a lot of them were going to music school, William Patterson, and a lot of these local jazz schools. And the guys from Blood, Sweat, and Tears would seek out musicians as the band kept going. The band started in '68. And here it is 43 years later, still going, but they would use local jazz musicians and bring them into the band. So a lot of the guys that I worked with would be out playing with David Clayton Thomas, with Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And they'd come home and they'd say, "Hey, Rob, you want to start a band? Because we want to just play some blues during the week. We're tired of going out and playing the Blood, Sweat, and Tears stuff." And I said, "Sure, And I said, "What do you want to call it?" And they said, "Well, we're living in Weehawken and Hoboken. Let's call it the Hudson River Rats." Mm-hmm. So they thought of the name. But it was basically Blood, Sweat, and Tears guys looking for a guy that could maybe front a band and do some blues and just go blow it out on a Wednesday night in New York City. So that's how that band started. Well, we did, and then now we're fast forwarding to about 1985. And here we are in New York City, the Hudson River Rats, just playing at a bar called Under Acme down in the Village. And still the blues scene hadn't really started to blossom yet in New York. New York never had a strong blues scene, but it really didn't come along until like the late 80s, early 90s.
The Stevie Ray Vaughan era.
Yeah, right, when that Robert Cray and Stevie Ray hit. But that was a little bit later, so still it was trying to make a mark, but it wasn't happening. But we were probably the only guys maybe playing some blues. There was Dan Lynch's great blues club that's legendary down in the Village, but only the real staunch blues guys went. Bill Dicey would play there every Sunday, and they had some people. Victoria Spivey was down there, but in Midtown and in other parts of town there wasn't a blues scene. So the deal was we would play, and we would go and do a set of just some blues stuff, and then the second set would be open for a jam. And I said, "Oh man, I hate coming all the way to New York to play a jam session," And they said, "No, we're just going to invite people up, but when they come up, they have to play a blues, no matter who they are." But we were starting to attract like some really good musicians. One night, Carole King would walk in, or Phoebe Snow, or Cyndi Lauper. I mean, people that were in New York, and then Will Lee. All these studio musicians were coming down. They were bored stiff. They were playing sessions all day and wanted to come down and play some blues. That was something that there was no rules or regulation. Just come up and play, and they understood that was the rule. They had to maybe shed a couple blues songs, because if they were going to come up, they had to know what they were doing. Yeah. So they did, and I started meeting all these people, and that became a scene, like a little bit of a scene. One night, I remember Julian Lennon came up to me. We're waiting online to go to the bathroom. The club was packed. Live at 5 came down. It became like a little scene where you can go hear some blues in the Village. And he goes, "I want to play a blues." He goes, "But I don't know what to play." He goes, "What should I?" And I said, "You're John Lennon's son. You can come up and play whatever you want, He goes, "Well, how about Johnny B. Good? That's a blues." And I said, "Yeah, it's a blues. Come on and play Johnny B. Good." Yeah. And started getting some phone calls because people were hearing me now sing as well. And that's when things started to happen, and I got a little bit of a reputation as a singer and harmonica player. And commercials. The cool thing about it was I had worked on some of those reading chops when I was studying. So in New York, time is money, and I started getting calls for maybe a Broadway show where they wanted to be able to read, or a commercial where they just needed to come in and read a part, or at least know enough about music so you can get in and out, that kind of thing. And I was singing on commercials, playing harmonica on commercials, getting called for some movie soundtrack stuff, getting called for some Broadway show stuff. And I'm saying, like, wow, this is great. It's almost like a little too much work, and I wanted. What about my band, So it was a juggling act, and I've learned to juggle over the years between the two. And now the studio scene's pretty much dried up with the digital revolution. So
Mm-hmm.
that's come to
The
a
home
run.
recording stuff.
Yeah.
One guy can do it all.
Yeah, you can be in your basement in Kansas. You don't need to be in Manhattan anymore. Save a whole lot of money on the string arrangements, so you don't
Yeah.
do it on a synth.
Yeah.
And but the cool thing about being a harmonica player is that we're a sweetener. You know, we're an instrument that even if they've saved thousands of dollars on the strings that they've done on a synthesizer or a fake drum track, a harmonica overdub or a guitar overdub will make that track sound a little bit more alive, or maybe real, for a 30-second commercial or a 60-second commercial.
And it's pretty hard to, the keyboard equivalent to the harmonica, pretty weak. It only happens now and again.
Yeah.
So it's nice that we have an instrument that is a little bit challenging to duplicate in the digital world.
Yeah. The funny thing about being in the studio scene, playing my harmonica, is you get a lot of calls, and some of it might be for blues. We want to do a little thing that's like a blues thing. And it might be also for pops. You know, as the harmonica became more out there in pop music, bands like War and whatever, you'd start to get calls. Hey, can you? And they'd put on a track like maybe it was a War track, but they couldn't copy it. But they'd say we want it to sound like that. You know, right away. Okay, so they're going after that. So maybe I could play 30 seconds of a Lee Oscar kind of a lick or something. You know. And one day I got called in and said, we're going to do a Molson Ale commercial. And okay. And they put on something, and I'm listening to it, and a harmonica comes on. And it's like this really fast, like real fast harmonica. And I said, what is that? You know, and I grabbed the CD, I'm looking, and it was Blues Traveler.
Uh-huh.
And I said, oh, Blues Traveler. And I'm looking at the back, and I'm looking at, and I recognize, and it said John Popper on vocals and harmonica. And I'm saying, like, I remember that name because I was judging me and Donnie, the late Donnie Brooks, great harmonica player from the New York area. He was originally from Texas, went on to play with Waylon Jennings and Judy Collins, ended up in New York, and he, before I was there, was doing most of the studio work on diatonic harmonica, from country to blues and that kind of stuff. He actually was there doing a lot of this behind the scenes before I even knew who he was. And when I got the call to go in to hear this spot, I realized that I remember I was already now working with Hohner harmonicas, and they said, would you judge a contest, you and Donnie Brooks? You can judge the blues stuff, you know, the blues and diatonic harmonica. And out of the, maybe 150 tapes, there was some pretty bad tapes in there. You know, we're talking cassette tapes here. And I would go through each one and I'd score them. And Donnie was doing the same thing at home. And then we'd send them the results to Hohner, and I guess they would pick who's going to win. Well, anyway, out of those 150 tapes, I wrote down 3 names that really impressed me. One was this John Popper, and another one was some guy, you think it was Gary Green, and another guy, I can't think of the third name, something Fleming or whatever it was. And I might have even made copies of their stuff because I thought it was pretty cool. And the rest of the stuff, I said, all right, you know. And but I remembered the name. I said, that's the kid from the harmonica contest. Now I'm in here, and I got to play a commercial and sound like this guy.
Yeah.
And he's, you know, John Popper plays a lot of rock,
very
fast
distinct
stuff,
yeah.
very distinct sound. And they said, could you do that? And I said, no, but I could maybe give you 30 seconds of it, you know, and it's kind of like that, you know.
Yeah.
And so it's funny when you're in the studio scene. It's whatever the flavor of the day is there. They were doing really well on the radio at that time, and they wanted their little commercial to sound like that to appeal to a younger audience or whatever it was. So you just never know what the call's going to be, whether it's going to be Bo Diddley or Dolly Parton coming into New York to do a session, or I played on a James Galway record, the flautist, you know. I mean, and that was pretty challenging too. So I mean, you never know what you're going to get a call to do. Sometimes it's blues, sometimes it ain't, you know.